Chapter 10. The Possibility of Evolution in Man. At the following meeting, Ouspensky reminded us of what he had previously said, that man fulfilled his duties as a transmitter of certain energies to the earth as he was, and that there was no need for him to change, but a man might desire to change for his own private reasons. Indeed, very little purpose would be served by this intensive self-study of ours if at the end of it all there existed no possibility of our ever becoming other than we were. All along I have pointed out to you, Ouspensky continued, that one of the features which distinguishes G's psychology from all other Western systems of psychology is that it proclaims this possibility of effecting a radical change in man. By prolonged inner struggle and effort, a man can become other than he was born. Ouspensky said that G had once pictured men as living in the basement of a house, quite unaware of the fact that there was much better rooms upstairs into which it was possible for them to gain an entry. But for this to happen, several conditions had to be satisfied by the basement dwellers. First, that they should realize how and where they were living and that there existed much better rooms upstairs. Second, that they obtained the help of someone who knew the way up to these more convenient premises. And third, that they were prepared to make the right kind of effort and for a very long period of time. Provided all these requirements were satisfied, change was possible. From the earliest of times it had been claimed that there existed three classical ways by which this kind of change could be brought about. The ways of the fakir, yogi, and monk, respectively. Each of these three paths to perfection was suited to the needs of a particular type of man. That of the fakir was appropriate for the man in whom moving center predominated. That of the yogi met the requirements of the man of intellect, and that of the monk appealed to the emotional type of man. The fakir struggled with his body, and after enduring immense hardships, he often succeeded in attaining will, but without having developed either his mind or his emotions. As a consequence of this, he was capable of doing things, but did not know what to do. The way of the yogi was the way of knowledge, and here attention was directed chiefly to the development of the mind and consciousness. In the religious way, the emotions played a predominant part. The monk spent many difficult years struggling with his worldly desires, and he sometimes obtained mastery over them at last through his faith, sacrifice, and devotion. Ouspensky pointed out that all the classical paths to development demanded of those who trod them two things: complete obedience to authority and retirement from the world. Half measures were often tried in the ways of the monk and the yogi, but rarely with any real result. For any real change to occur, the devotee must be prepared to abandon his family, his friends, and his home, renounce all his possessions, and enter a yogi school or a monastery. Ouspensky told us that after G had discussed the three classical methods of development with the members of his Moscow group, he had told them that there existed yet a fourth way, which was sometimes called the way of the sly man. It had been given this name because those who followed it were in possession of certain knowledge which was unknown to the fakir, the yogi, or the priest, and which was of great profit to him. This fourth way had several advantages over the older traditional methods of development. One was that it did not require complete retirement from the world, and another that it substituted understanding for obedience to authority. Yet a third advantage attached to this method was that it worked on all three centers simultaneously, so that progress was likely to be more rapid than on the better known ways of the yogi and the monk. Moreover, the teacher of this fourth method of development always took special note of the personal characteristics of his pupils, and this led to their being given much more individual attention. Ouspensky now talked to us at the next few meetings about this fourth way, and one of the things he said about it was that it was a very difficult way to find. Schools of the fourth way appeared suddenly, carried on their work for a time, and then disappeared, so that a man might regard himself as indeed fortunate if he managed to discover such a school and found himself in a position to profit from its existence. Although this was never directly claimed by Ouspensky, many of his followers assumed that the meetings we were attending were the preliminaries to the opening of a school of this kind in London. Whether they were right in coming to this conclusion or not is immaterial. What was of importance to us was that we were working in accordance with school methods. In the first place, we were replacing obsolete and erroneous ideas in an intellectual center by ideas which we believed to be much nearer to the truth, and by doing this we were acquiring a great many new attitudes and points of view. We were also struggling with our identifications and negative emotions, and finally we were learning the complicated movements and Eastern dances taught by G at the Chateau in Fontainebleau. It must be borne in mind that G brought back from his extensive travels two things in addition to the system of ideas which we were now studying, namely, a number of complicated exercises in temple dances and music which he had acquired from many different sources. He considered all three of these important from the East. He considered all three of these importations from the East as of important and worthy of study. Indeed, in most European circles, Gurdjieff was regarded not so much as a philosopher, but as one of the greatest living experts on the sacred dances of the East. What may be of interest to many readers is that in a letter written by Madame Blavatsky to one of the early members of the Theosophical Society, she foretells that the next great teacher of Eastern ideas in Europe will be an instructor in Oriental dancing. Long ago, Ouspensky spoke to us of the fourth way. He had pointed out that when people speak of the further evolution of man, they do so without ever stopping to define what they really mean by this. They have no idea of what a Superman would be like, but project on him the qualities which they happen to admire most: intellectual brilliance, creative genius, great sensitivity, courage, or spirituality. In other words, they are quite unable to say precisely what line evolution would take in a man. So also are people unable to say what they mean by the term a great man. G's system gives exact knowledge on both these subjects. It starts by stating that there are in all seven different categories of men. The first three including men on an ordinary human level, and the latter four categories being reserved for men who have reached a higher level than the ordinary one. In other words, men 1, 2, and 3 are all men in whom no evolution at all has occurred, the only difference between them being with regard to the center which is most active in them. Man number 1 is a man in whom the moving center predominates. Man number 2 is a man who is ruled by his emotional center, and man number 3 a man in whom intellectual center tends to prevail. Every man is born man 1, 2, or 3, but in some individuals the preponderance of one center over the others is so slight that it is difficult to place them in their appropriate groups. Such people are well balanced, but the important thing to remember is that they all stand on the same level of being. Men 4, 5, and 6 are quite different from men 1, 2, and 3. They never occur naturally, but are always the products of special knowledge, inner work, and struggle. Man number 4 will be described later, but man number 5 is a man who has attained unity, who is in possession of a permanent I, and who, in consequence of this, does not alter from hour to hour, or even from minute to minute, as we ordinary men and women do. In G's words, man number 5 is a man in whom crystallization has taken place around some single motive, and because he is a man with a single permanent aim, his knowledge partakes of this same uniform character also. Man number 5 possesses, in addition to this, true self-consciousness and the capacity to make use of one or two higher centers, namely his higher emotional center. Man number 6 has all the qualities of man number 5 and has attained a still higher level of consciousness, so that in him work not only higher emotional, but also higher intellectual center. In consequence of this, he is able to see not only himself, but also the universe objectively. Yet even a man so highly developed as this may lose all that he has gained, and it is only in man number 7, the highest level of being which man is capable of reaching, that knowledge and being are permanent and can never be lost. Man number 7 was also described by G as being immortal within the limits of the solar system. Man number 4 should be looked upon as being a man in a state of transition from the ground level of man number 1, 2, or 3 to the level of man number 5. There is nothing at all permanent in him beyond his aim. He, like the higher categories of man, never occur naturally, but is always the product of special knowledge, conscious effort, and inner struggle. Ouspensky said that it could be said of man number 4 that he was beginning to know himself, and that his centers were more balanced and worked better than did the centers of men 1, 2, and 3. Another advantage enjoyed by man number 4 was that he had developed within him a fixed point, or what Ouspensky called a permanent center of gravity, to which everything was referred in him. He resembled, therefore, a man in possession of a reliable chart and compass, and this was a great boon to him, for even if he failed to do what he set out to do, he at any rate knew the direction in which he had to struggle. Ouspensky added one more interesting detail to the above description of the 7 different categories of men. He told us that G had said that it sometimes happened that a man skipped the transitional stage of man number 4 and crystallized out directly as man number 5. Such a man had attained unity, but it might be a unity resting on an entirely unsatisfactory basis. And G had given as an example of this wrong form of crystallization the Caucasian brigands he had often watched in the mountains in his youth. These men could stand patiently behind a rock, holding their rifles at the ready, tortured by flies and by the heat of the sun, for as much as 8 hours at a stretch without complaining. They could tolerate all sorts of discomforts and tortures, and had acquired great inner unity and strength, but all for no purpose other than that of brigandage. Wrong crystallizations of this kind have very tragic consequences. After having discussed with us the various categories of men, Ouspensky repeated the statement he had so often made before, that a man's knowledge depended on his level of being. Consequently, the knowledge, art, science, philosophy, and religion belonging to each of these different categories of men were knowledge, art, science, philosophy, and religion of very different levels also. There was the religion and the art of man 1, 2, and 3, and the religion and the art of men 5, 6, and 7. And in speaking, therefore, of such subjects as art, culture, knowledge, and religion, it was always necessary first to state the level of the religion or of the art to which one was referring. This applied not only to any discussion about the different religions existing in the world, but also to a discussion about a single religion, such as Christianity, for there were as many different levels of Christianity as there were different levels of men. On the ground level, there was the purely imitative Christianity of man number 1, the man dominated by his moving center, the highly emotional and often fanatical Christianity of man number 2, and the intellectual Christianity of man number 3, the kind of Christianity which was based on arguments, dialects, and abstruse theological theories. There was also the Christianity of the saint, that is to say, of the man who had attained unity and had reached a higher level of being. A man such as the last named was capable of knowing and doing things far beyond the power of ordinary men to know and do. The saint only had the ability to live in accordance with the exalted principles which Christ had laid down for the guidance of his small band of disciples. And it was absurd, therefore, to speak of Christianity as though there was only one form of Christianity, or of Christians as though they were all equally Christian. Ouspensky again drew our attention to the fact that Christ spoke to his disciples quite differently from the way in which he spoke to the multitude. He also expected of them a much higher standard of understanding and conduct than could be demanded of the crowds who followed him only for the sake of witnessing wonders or of being treated for their diseases. When on one occasion his disciples came to Christ after the multitude had left him, and asked him why he had spoken to people only in parables, he answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of heaven, but to them it is not given. This is from Matthew chapter 13, verse 2. And again, unto you is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to others in parables, that seeing they might not see, and hearing they might not understand. From Luke chapter 8, verse 10. Ouspensky said that there was yet another difference between ordinary men and more highly evolved men, or what G often called them in the true sense of the word. Or what G often called men in the true sense of the word. In order to understand this difference, it would be necessary to refer to the ancient doctrine of the 4 bodies of man. The idea that man possessed four bodies was an ancient one, common to many religions, and at one time it had been an important doctrine in both Christianity and Hinduism. The first of the four bodies was the ordinary physical body, known to the early Christians as the carnal body. The other three bodies were composed of finer and finer materials, each permeating the other in the way in which he had previously described the finer hydrogens as pervading the coarser ones. He reminded us of the important fact that, according to G's system, matter possessed cosmic and psychic attributes, and, this being so, these finer bodies had particular cosmic and psychic properties. The consciousness of each of these successive bodies was capable of controlling not only itself, but also the coarser body in which it had been formed. In Christian terminology, the names of these finer bodies were the natural, the spiritual, and the finest and highest of them all, the divine body. Thus, the Theosophists, who had taken over the idea of the four bodies from an older Hindu teaching, called them the physical, astral, mental, and causal bodies. But, continued Ouspensky, there is an important difference between the teaching of the Theosophists and that of G on this subject of the four bodies. The Theosophists assume that man already possesses these finer bodies, whereas G states quite clearly that they exist only in more fully developed men, and all four of them only in man number 7. These finer bodies are quite unnecessary for ordinary living, and since we are able to discharge our cosmic functions without them, there is no need for anyone to acquire them. A man may even appear to be spiritually developed without them, for the finer materials out of which the higher bodies are made exist in him, although not yet organized into bodies. Outwardly, the ordinary man and the more developed man appear to be the same, the difference between them showing itself in the fact that whereas the activities of the man in possession of four bodies are determined by his higher bodies, those of the ordinary man are determined by his physical body. Ouspensky then described how the higher bodies were formed in man. He began by explaining that in a state of waking sleep, the state in which we lived, we expended so much of the finer hydrogens we produced on wrong activities, such as our various identifications, that insufficient were left over for the purposes even of right living, let alone for such a non-essential work as for the forming of higher bodies. But if a man worked on himself for a very long period of time, he might eventually accumulate sufficient of these higher materials, first to permit his awakening himself from sleep, and then to lay down within his ordinary tissues the first of these finer bodies. If he continued to work in this way, the same process might be repeated. By saving and creating more and more of the finer hydrogens or energies in himself, he might store enough of them to allow of the formation within the second body of the third body, and eventually of the formation within that third body of the fourth body. Ouspensky said that in certain other Eastern teachings, the first body was the carriage, body, the second body was the horse, emotions and desires, the third body, the driver, mind, and the fourth body, the master, consciousness, permanent I, and will, see figure 7. But, he said in conclusion, the important thing to remember is that these finer bodies never occur naturally, but are always the result of spiritual development. They, together with the inner psychological changes linked up with them, are the distinguishing mark of the more highly evolved man. Man, in the full sense of that word. Ouspensky then drew 2 diagrams on the blackboard in order to illustrate the difference between the workings of an ordinary mechanical man and of a developed man possessed of all 4 bodies. Ordinary mechanical man was set in action by the impact of external influences on his physical body, which evoked in him various emotions. I like, I dislike, I want, I don't want. His thoughts were evoked by these various emotions, and will was completely absent in him. All that he possessed in place of will was a number of desires of greater or lesser duration. If his desires were of a more lasting character, he was regarded as a man of strong will, and if they were fleeting, he was considered to be a man of weak will. The controlling force of a man who was in possession of the 3 finer bodies moved in precisely the opposite direction. It originated in the 4th body, which possessed a permanent I, full consciousness and will. His thoughts obeyed the commands of his 4th body, and his desires were single and in harmony with his thoughts. Finally, his physical body was the obedient instrument of his thoughts and his emotions. Figure 7a. This represents the functioning of ordinary mechanical man, possessing a physical body only. All of his functions depend on external influences acting on his physical body. B represents the functioning of a developed man, possessing four bodies. In this case, functions start from consciousness and will, the same idea of the functioning of developed man expressed in the Eastern parable of the master, driver, horse, and carriage. I'm going to briefly go over this figure. So there's three different levels, A, B, and C. A has an arrow going from left to right, starting with automatum reacting to external influence, desires evoked in body, thoughts aroused by desires, different eyes and wills corresponding to different desires. And then B, the arrows going from right to left. So we have I, consciousness, will, then thought obedient to consciousness and will, emotions in harmony with thought, and then body obedient to emotions and intelligence. And then on level C, the arrow is again going from right to left. We have master, I, consciousness, will, causal body, driver, mind, mental body, horse, feelings, desires, astral body, carriage, physical body. Continuing the text, Uspensky said that G made use of two parables for the purpose of showing the way in which the functions of the finer bodies worked in a fully developed man. The first of these two parables was the very ancient one of the carriage, horse, driver, and master. The ordinary physical body was represented by the carriage. The second body was the horse, desires and emotions. The third body, the driver, mind. And the fourth body, the master, full consciousness and will. The master first gave instructions to the driver. The driver listened to these orders and drove the horse. The horse pulled the carriage in the required direction. The alternative parable to this was the story of the man living in the house of the 4 rooms. At first he inhabited the poorest of these rooms, and did not know until he was told about it that there were 3 additional rooms in the house filled with treasure. With the help of a teacher, he eventually found the keys of these other rooms, but only when he had gained entry into the 4th and most important of these rooms did he become the real master of the house. Uspensky said that all religious and other ways to perfection were concerned with the gaining of an entrance into this 4th room. G had added that there existed certain artificial ways of gaining temporary admission into the 4th room. There were also entirely illegitimate methods of doing this, which might lead to very bad results. What the man was contrived to get into the 4th room by such methods actually found when he got there varied in different cases, but he might well find that the room was devoid of all treasure. Soon afterwards the meetings at Warwick Gardens were suspended for a week or 2, and this gave me the opportunity to think over the question of man's evolution. What had the scientists to say on this important subject? So far as I could find out, the majority of biologists and anthropologists believed that mechanical evolution, as described by Darwin, had come to an end in man, and that he had attained by this means all that he could ever hope to get. When one looked at the evolutionary movement as a whole, one saw that it had worked by pressing life into what might be called the empty evolutionary spaces, that is to say, into those regions in which the various potentialities in the different tissues of an animal could be actualized. But, as Julian Huxley has pointed out, all evolutionary trends eventually reach their limits and become stabilized. Consequently, when the major groups of animals are examined, they are seen to radiate into a number of different but closely allied types, which are all on the same evolutionary level. Very rarely does any group succeed in doing what man has achieved, namely, to break through the ceiling and thus attain a higher evolutionary level. A breakthrough of this kind onto a higher plane happened when man attained the ability to speak, for this allowed him to hand down to his offspring inherited ideas, thus opening up to him an entirely new form of evolution. It is also possible that another breakthrough onto a higher level happened when Cro-Magnon man climbed up into an entirely strange world of aesthetic and religious values some 15,000 years ago. For it was at about that time that man began to embark on activities which possessed no survival value at all, such as the ornamentation of his weapons, the decoration of his caves, and the practice of ritual. It is possible that humanity is on the eve of yet another breakthrough onto a higher level, brought about this time by his own inner efforts and not by outer circumstances. Sorry, I'm going to read that again. Is it possible that humanity is on the eve of yet another breakthrough onto a higher level, brought about this time by his own inner efforts and not by outer circumstances? This is a momentous question, but Lowes Dickinson seems to have had it in mind when he wrote the following: Man is in the making, but henceforth he must make himself. To that point nature has led him out of the primeval slime. She has given him limbs, she has given him a brain, she has given him the rudiments of a soul. Now it is for him to make or mar that splendid torso. Let him no more look to her for aid, for it is her will to create, one who has the power to create himself. Lowes Dickinson, from A Modern Symposium. Lowes Dickinson's words resemble those used by Ouspensky when he stressed to us that nature did not require any further evolution of man, and was even opposed to it. This being so, any further evolution would have to be a conscious evolution, and consciousness could never evolve mechanically and unconsciously. Progress along this line would entail also the evolution of man's will, and will would never evolve involuntarily. As I usually did after I had studied the ideas of the system, I searched amongst my Indian books, and in the Yajurveda found the following reference to the evolution of man. Quote, I have arisen from the earth to the mid-world. I have arisen from the mid-world to heaven. From the level of the firmament of heaven, I have gone to the sun-world, the light. Sri Aurobindo's comments on this pronouncement concerning the various stages of man's progression, and states that the earth represents the world of matter, the low level from which man's body started, and that the mid-world represents man's attainment of the level of life. By the firmament of heaven is meant the plane of the pure mind, and by the level of the sun is meant the attainment of supermind or higher consciousness. And as I thought of these mysteries, there came into my mind the words used by G many years previously, when he had replied to a question asked by one of his Moscow groups. In comparison with the intelligence of the earth, the sun's intelligence is divine. I also recalled how angry Plotinus came with the Gnostics for denying the divinity of the sun and the stars, which seemed to him far higher in the scale of being than human beings.